Hi everyone, welcome to episode 3 of Tumbando El Sistema, One Talk at a Time. My name is Gabby Montes and I'll be your host tonight. At this time, I want to introduce each panelist. So from the class of 2020, we have Jane, Bella, Mustafa, Albin, and Avery. And then from the class of 2021, we have Juan. And from the class of 2022, we have Courtney. Thank you guys for being here tonight, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here and being willing to engage in these conversations. So this session tonight is going to explore privilege and disadvantage. But before diving into any content, if there are any moments in which audience members agree with a comment or question posed or disagree, we want you to engage with the discussion via the chat box, the Q&A. And if at any point you have a question regarding anything discussed, just use the Q&A icon, as at the end we're going to have a time for Q&A discussion and the panelists will answer those questions. So previously in session 2 of Tumbando El Sistema, One Talk at a Time, the theme was Latinx and Blackness. And today we're going to switch that up a little bit. So how many of you panelists have had a direct conversation with someone about privilege in the past week? Raise your hand. Awesome, awesome. So this is exactly why we're here today. We're here to explore this topic that's sometimes discussed and sometimes not. So the first question I have for you guys is, what is oppression or disadvantage? How do you define that?
I think oppression and disadvantage relates to when people are treated unfairly for things that they cannot control. For example, things that they're born with, like a racial identity, for example, or a certain hair texture. That's how I would define it.
I would think that oppression and disadvantage are kind of similar, but then they have their own separate time. Oppression being that it is more of a systematic thing where the government itself may not necessarily be directly putting us down, but the laws that they enforce does, and the biases that are in place inside that society are putting someone down. While a disadvantage would be more of like an economic, like an example of a disadvantage would be more like a social economic class deterrent. So people in poverty are at a disadvantage, but they might not necessarily be oppressed. While like a black person would be more oppressed than like a white person who was poor.
Definitely. I'm really happy you commented on that because I was going to ask what the difference between oppression and disadvantage was. And just to save us some time, I'm going to give some working definitions that we found so that we can dive into the deeper conversation beyond just the definitions. So for oppression, it's the combination of prejudice and institutional power, which creates a system that discriminates against some groups and benefits other groups, just like Juan was just describing. And for disadvantage, it's an unfavorable circumstance or condition that reduces the chances of success or effectiveness. So just like Juan was commenting on, you can kind of see the difference in that institutional aspect of it. So jumping into the next question, what do you think are some examples of some more overt forms of oppression?
So I like what Juan said about indirect. So for example, if you word a job posting in such a way that it eliminates female applicants, I think that's
Definitely. What are some other overt forms of oppression?
What do you mean by overt? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. So overt forms of oppression are things that are more obvious. You see it directly happening, whereas next we're going to go into covert, and those are those more indirect forms of oppression. So right now we're talking about obvious, direct forms of oppression.
Well, I guess one that's kind of prevalent in what we're going through now, but the police brutality, even though yes, it can be done on multiple different people of different skin color and different races and backgrounds. But as of right now, with the Black Lives Matter movement going on, where they are particularly stemming towards racial tensions where Black people and people of color are oppressed by the police officers for no real reason, and for for pop culture, and I guess Karens too. Some Karens might come at people, Black people who are just in a barbecue for no reason.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And do you want to speak more on Karen's one, just in case any viewer doesn't know what Karen means?
Okay, well, a Karen is a white woman or older white woman who is attacking either like an establishment because she doesn't like what the establishment is doing to her for now. For an example, for right now is like how some people are angry that they have to wear masks going into like public spaces. If you see someone saying, "Oh, I want to talk to your manager about this," that's kind of a Karen, and Karens can go from establishments, and they can also attack people who are just like minding their business, doing their day to day life things. If in this sense, if a black person is in a predominantly white neighborhood and they actually live there, they might stop them and say, "Oh, where do you live? I want your identification. Why are you around here?" So that's what like Karens kind of do.
Definitely. And that's definitely a great example because Karens are more overt forms of oppression because they're directly engaging and directly showing oppression to individuals. So kind of switching it up, what are some covert, unconscious, or indirect forms of oppression? Things that are not as obvious.
Personally, I think a big thing is just, like implicit bias, so unconscious bias. And there's many, many forms. So if you're talking about implicit racism, implicit sexism, implicit homophobia, etc. And I think it's something that's really hard to handle because, we're socialized by society and we live in a sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic society that really discriminates against any like marginalized communities. So a lot of people are acting with this bias that's unconscious that they're not even aware of. And it's sort of like, is it their fault? Because, it's society who socialized them to be that way.
Definitely. That's a great way of describing it. And so can white people be oppressed?
I think white people can be oppressed, not for the color of their skin, but if, based on their like gender orientation or sexual orientation or gender expression, then they can be oppressed in that way. But in terms of being oppressed because they're white, I don't think so.
I would agree with that. I don't think that whiteness alone is oppressible. A, because white people have historically been the oppressors, and B, because the impact of any discrimination that a white person could face is never going to destabilize their position as a white person in the way that it has for so many other communities. So I also don't think that white people can be oppressed.
And so I'm kind of hearing like this idea that like white people can be oppressed, but it's usually for other identity groups that they have and not necessarily for their whiteness. So does that mean that all BIPOC experience oppression or disadvantage?
I would say yes in some form of another, because like for a person of color, we experience oppression on a day to day, everyday basis. It's like for an example, like the other day, um, one of my I was talking to one of my friends about something, and I mentioned how someone was being a little being a little bit racist towards me, and I shrugged it off because I'm just so desensitized to it. So I think that like as a person of color, we experience way more oppressions, and especially if you're a part of the LGBTQ community, it's even 10 times worse for you because not only are you a person of color, but then you're also not necessarily a cis person or normal conformity male female. I have to agree. I have to say that yeah, we are oppressed like the max.
Definitely.
It definitely varies to different extents for different races and also within races, because colorism is very persistent in the Black community, but then also from my own experiences, I know that colorism is also pretty pervasive amongst Asian people as well. Lighter skin is more sought out for in Asian cultures because I think it has some kind of historical and societal context to it, in that the people that tend to have darker skin are the ones that are working outside and doing the hard labor, whereas historically Asians with paler skin were inside more and weren't doing all the hard labor, and which is a sign of wealth. So colorism is certainly a factor into which that contributes to the varying levels of oppression that BIPOC people face.
Definitely.
I think for many people, there's this ongoing myth that if you reach a certain economic status, you are no longer going to feel any racial bias or discrimination. And we find that that's not true. I mean, a Black man went to one of the highest offices in our land and experienced tremendous amounts of racism. And so I just wanted to add that in there, that your economic status doesn't absolve you from experiencing, racism and oppression in America.
Yeah, definitely. And like when we asked a poll, we did a poll and we asked individuals whether all BIPOC experienced the same level of oppression, and 95% said no and 5% said yes. So let's dive into why we think 95% said no to that.
I think people of darker skin tones are oppressed more than people of lighter skin tones. And I think it's related to the topic of colorism, just like Jane was mentioning. It's definitely prevalent in Latin America, whereas I guess like I would identify as a white Latinx person, but in my country, I've seen some disturbing examples of colorism in the streets where people of my skin tone in the Dominican Republic would say very harsh things to, for example, Haitians or even to darker Dominicans, and they try to dehumanize them and like shrug them off as Haitians, even though they're Dominican. And it's I definitely think that not all people are oppressed equally. Not all BIPOC people are oppressed equally. I definitely think darker toned people are more oppressed.
I would say if we look at this historically, in the context of America, I know for a fact that we can say people such as Native Americans, Indigenous people, and African Americans have a deep seat of oppression in America that many other people of color do not have, due to the history just of slavery and oppression that has mounted up to this degree, and we're still fighting. So I would just throw that in the ring, and I would agree with the poll with the 95%.
Yeah, I will also agree with the poll and Alvin and Avery on that, because especially what Alvin was saying, that one kind of hit me personally, because I am Afro Latino also, and I know a lot of times growing up I was told that like specifically I'm Puerto Rican. I've been told like when growing up I'm a fake Puerto Rican because my name's Juan Rodriguez, but I'm dark, right? And just recently someone was asking me, oh, like, are you Spanish? And I'm like, I'm Latino. And she's like, oh, well, I thought that I didn't know if I should ask or not, because you're dark. I know that, a lot of Spanish people, again, not Spanish, Latino. I know a lot of Spanish people are light skinned. And I'm like, well, people in the Caribbean come from a lot of different places. Some come from Spain, some come from, Portugal, and predominantly a lot of them come from Africa, from the West Indian Trade Company. And so hearing people talk about how their own, not even like people outside of your race, but like people in your own ethnicity, bring other people down because oh, I'm darker than you, or you're lighter than me. It kind of is really off-putting, and I would have to say like it's true. It's a real thing.
Going back to part B, the can white people be oppressed? I was thinking of some friends I have who are white, who went to high school, middle school with me, who came from low income backgrounds. So, but they're treated unfairly in the sense that people assume because they're white, they're rich and all that, but they don't get those benefits. So they're treated unfairly in that sense. But I think some people were saying that white people can be oppressed, but not because of their race. So I was asking, what about in that case?
Going back to the definition of oppression, the component of institutionalism, I think, is important too. I think that certain white individuals can experience some level of comments related to race towards them that is derogatory, or so like if they're assumed to be like of some economic class. But I think like when we're talking on the discussion of, or like on the topic of oppression, like on a systemic and grander scheme of things, I would say that overall, no. They, like Bella had said before, they were always, historically, they have been in the position of the oppressor. And so, like, not to diminish any experiences of individuals, but I think from like an overall sense and going back to the definition of what oppression is, I think systemically they have not been oppressed.
I would just 1,000% agree with Jane. One of the things that I'll say is when you have a system, and that's one of the working parts of the definition of oppression, an actual institution that's working against a group of people. When you have a system that was designed for you, that was within its framework for you, I don't think that amounts to the couple unfair assertions. I don't think one is greater than I'm not diminishing anyone's experience. However, we have to note that this system, this experiment we call the United States of America, designed for the Anglo-Saxon white man. And I think that is something to just make clear.
They weren't necessarily oppressed. They were more of, they had prejudice done against them, you know, and they were they have a disadvantage again because that's an economical situation. You know, it's not necessarily like, while yes, sometimes economic situations are outside of our hands, and oppression is more of, like everyone has been saying, it is a systematic thing. And what Avery was saying, I like how he worded, hit around the nail, was just that, you know, this society and this system was made to make them better, right? While yes, you grew up with them, you grew up with some friends who were white, and they were, you know, they were economically crippled. You know, I did the same thing. That wasn't their fault, but while they live in this system, they can easily rise up higher or better or faster than any of us on this call right now. So they will never, and that's just simply because of their skin color. They will never be oppressed in this system as long as it is the way it is. So.
Mhm. And Juan, you actually provided the perfect transition, to be honest, because we've been talking about oppression, but you kind of started to bring up privilege. So, like, what is privilege?
Well, I think privilege is when you're, in this sense, is when you're able to do things and say things, and there's nothing done to you for doing or saying those things. For an example, like, so there, I was looking through Facebook at different like things concerning this, and on the web and just in general, and how sometimes like a black person who is arrested for having marijuana, right? They'll be charged with a harder sentence rather than a person who was white who was caught with marijuana, you know. And all of the, this might get a little bit too deep, but with all of the some college students who are white, and they might be an athlete and they have rape charges against them, right? The judge say, oh, you know, I don't want to ruin his life for just, you know, 10 minutes of play. Well, like that's not right. You know, that's privilege. You know, you are letting him, a rapist, go, or someone who had, or deeming someone who is black with a marijuana charge worse than someone who is a rapist and who sexually assaulted a woman on campus. You know, that's terrible, right? That is what privilege is.
To go even further on that, yeah, it is when you can do or say things and not be affected. But I think it's also when you can ignore and like continue to live your best life without losing benefits.
That's a great way to expand on that. And Bella, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of reiterate what Mustafa said. I do think that privilege is kind of like the gift of ignorance. It's being able to live your whole life not knowing that a certain kind of oppression exists because you've never been subjected to it and you've never really had to think about it. And it's also, you know, being exposed to opportunities and never having to think, you know, why did I get this? Or, you know, could I not have, like, would I not have gotten this if I were, you know, of a different race or, you know, have a different background. And I think that, like, being able to live your life without kind of having those questions in the back of your mind is a big privilege.
I want to say too, I just love that we also added the point of ignorance. being a part of the privilege discussion, because many people don't realize that the wealth that white Americans were able to accumulate for just real estate set them up in a different financial bracket than most, and if not all, African Americans. And that is a privilege. I think one word that we can use for privilege is a head start, because many white Americans have that. And I think that's something to be noted.
Definitely. And can we like come up with some concrete examples of overt versus covert privilege, kind of like we did for oppression earlier? So like, what are some more obvious forms of privilege versus more indirect ones?
So just some examples that I thought of. So for, you know, an example of privilege is not having to, if you're going to go travel outside to another country, not having to look up what is racism like in this country. I think another example is for women, or not just women, you know, black men and women, for example, when they're going in for a job interview, they have to, you know, like maybe just like think about what they should do with their hair before they go in, because there's like a certain like professionalism when it's in terms of like what your hair looks like. Another form of privilege is not fearing for your life when you're pulled over by a police officer.
I think we can list them out, just keep going, right? I mean, I was thinking one form of privilege would be to have to augment your voice to have some sort of colloquial white voice that they desire. I just think that's something that just came to my mind regarding a privilege.
So I don't necessarily have an example. I wasn't sure if everyone was done listing examples, but I wanted to touch on the idea of the ignorance that we were talking about. The definition of ignorance is the lack of knowledge or something. And like over time, like me personally, I don't necessarily blame, you know, someone for not knowing something, right? You know, I have some white friends who come to me and ask me, you know, questions about things, and if they're trying to learn and they're being, you know, respectful about it, that's different. I think the ignorance that we're talking about is ignoring the facts, ignoring different things, and not necessarily not knowing, but knowing that it's there and blatantly ignoring it. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and like to build on that, I think like it can be difficult to recognize your privilege, like as human beings, because we tend to be around what makes us comfortable, right? So that's why I feel like coming to college, for example, it puts you in it makes you get out of your comfort zone, because you're in a different environment, you're around different types of people. So in many cases, people are able to recognize the privilege there. And I think like in your case, Juan, like a lot of your friends might have asked these questions. They probably before meeting you, maybe they weren't in an environment where they would be able to ask those questions and, you know, and be curious. So.
And to kind of take the conversation one step further, we've definitely talked about privilege a lot, but I feel like we're very focused on white privilege right now. So I guess the question is, can BIPOC have privilege? Why not?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know myself as a man, I have a privilege and as a black man, I have a privilege that a black woman may not have because I'm a man. You know, we see this all the time when I'm with my girlfriend. You know, she may say something and some people might not take it as serious because a woman is saying it, until you get a little, you know, bass in your voice, right? And and have to really assert what's going on in the situation. And we see that a lot, you know, even, I mean, down to the minuscule, I'm right-handed. There's a privilege for being right-handed than there is for someone that is left-handed. And so just as we talk about privilege and as we, you know, make it a little broader context than just white privilege, like you said, I think that's something to consider.
I definitely think you touched on a pretty important point, that privilege manifests itself in a lot of different ways. I mean, we talk about white privilege because it's very, you know, important in our society, but I think there are privileges that come with, you know, your gender, with being a cisgendered person, heterosexual person. There's even, people say, pretty privilege, and there's privilege that comes, you know, in a lot of different forms, which I think that is why people struggle to talk about it, because a lot of people say, well, I don't have privilege in this one area, so I must not be privileged at all. And I think a lot of people choose to ignore the privileges that they do have in order to feel oppressed.
Yeah, something that I want to touch on as an Asian American is the model minority myth. And so for a lot of people that may seem like a positive thing, and I do want to recognize that there are privileges that come with it, because, you know, like we're set aside on this pedestal as, look at this race, they came to America, they worked hard, they can be successful. But when that's turned against Black and Latino people as, you know, if you work just as hard as them, like you could be just as successful as them, which obviously is a deeply flawed way of thinking, and as a result perpetuates anti-Blackness and pits communities of colors against each other. So the model minority myth, I want to emphasize that it is a myth. And it's harmful to other races, and it's harmful to Asian Americans as well. Like, you know, it diminishes our experiences with racism. So like the way that I view the model minority myth is that, you know, like we were let into this club of privilege. And so like any racial experiences that we may encounter may be diminished or even invalidated just because, you know, we have this privilege pass. But, you know, like the moment that I realized that it certainly was a myth was when a deadly disease that originated from China started spreading in this country. And so anyone that looked even remotely Chinese was dirty and disgusting. And the reason that this deadly disease started spreading in America. And so they were abused, spat on, and brutalized. And so it's important to reject this as Asian Americans because we have not achieved full equality. And so we need to fight for full equality for everybody until our differences are celebrated instead of seen as something to be oppressed.
Jane, you're preaching, sis.
I think another form of privilege comes in like related to religion. Some people of different religions have different things that they, for example, cannot eat. And I think it's a privilege for other people of different religions to go into a restaurant and be able to eat anything off the menu without having to worry if there's pork in it or something like that. And so I think religion is one sort of privilege.
Well, not even just, I want to go on more what Alvin was saying, not even just something like that. Well, that's between, I guess, Orthodox religions more. But so like for me, I don't believe in any of the traditional Orthodox religions. So I don't feel comfortable talking about that because a lot of times people shut me down. A lot of people or they will disregard what I say and make it seem like I'm crazy or like I'm weird or something because I believe in something else that they don't believe in because it's not normal. You know, that's another form of privilege for more the Orthodox versus the non-Orthodox people.
Definitely. And we've kind of started touching on this already, but like the idea that can some BIPOC groups have more privilege over other groups? What do you guys think about that? And if so, what groups do you think have more privilege and why?
I think that any cisgender male in a BIPOC group will have automatically, you know, more privilege than other members of those groups because, like Avery was saying, you know, I have way more privilege than you know someone maybe like as Courtney or Gabby would have, or even Jane, you know, or even Bella. I like me being a Black male. Yes, I have disadvantages and I have oppression I have to deal with, but not as much as like the wage gap where I make more money in jobs than than a woman would make, right? Or someone will take something that I'm saying more seriously, as what Avery was saying, rather than what if it was coming from a woman's mouth. So I think that I think that a male, a cisgender male of any BIPOC group would be more privileged.
So do any of the people who identify as women in the chat have an opinion on
I
this?
think it really depends on the space because I think it's very easy for us just to take the terms and be like, because you have this, this, and this, you're automatically going to be less privileged or more oppressed. And when you look at it like from a statistic standpoint, yes, but then I feel like it really depends on the space because I feel like in certain spaces and certain situations, one group might have more advantages or might have more disadvantages. But then taking it further than that, it depends who's in the room. Which is what makes it really complicated. But what I'm really looping around to is having the conversations, but I guess in a way that we're not invalidating people's experiences. Because me and my mom actually got into a big discussion about colorism. Because if people don't know, I'm actually 25% white. My mom's half white. And then I have two sisters that are 75% white. So we have all spectrums in my family. And even though systemically, and like if you're looking at statistics, I may be more oppressed because of where my mom grew up. She actually grew up in England. She faced a lot more discrimination because I don't know what the Black population is in England, but she faced a lot more individualized discrimination. But even when you're looking at it in America, I feel like it's just hard and it really depends on the space. So yes, while looking at statistics, I feel like it's very easy to say this group has more privileges. But I guess we just need to be careful that we're not invalidating, because it depends where people grew up, the spaces they're in, the situations as to like what discrimination they faced. But discrimination and oppression is different. So that's also something to consider.
I just want to make sure the question is clear. So the question is, do people in the BIPOC community, does one group have greater privilege than the other? Okay.
Yeah, you got it right.
I want to say yes, and I want to say yes in the American context, and I want to say yes because I don't know why this comes to my mind, but when I think of African Americans dealing with reparations and how we still have not gotten any form of any type of reparation, but there are other people, minorities in America who have received reparations. I think that could definitely be seen as a form of privilege that Black Americans don't have versus others. That just first came to my mind.
So I guess I want to add in from my own experience, I guess, as a white or white passing Hispanic woman, I think that I have a lot of privilege compared to a lot of other people in my community, and it comes up in different ways. For example, when you see Latinx people in movies or in media, or when you think about Latinx representation, a lot of times, or most of the time, people look like me. It's Latinx people that are lighter skinned, and there isn't a lot of representation for other Latinx identities. And I definitely think that, I don't know how much I relate to the term person of color, but as a Hispanic woman, I do think that I have a lot of privileges that other people in my community don't.
And to say that is not to invalidate anyone's experience. I don't think the invalidation is the question at all. I think we're just trying to get to a place of fact and a place of realization that not all of us are oppressed equally.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we're trying to get at. And that's the whole point of this whole conversation, like in general. So we've also been saying the term BIPOC a lot, and I just want to take a moment to define it just in case someone didn't know what it meant, or someone's watching and they're like, what is that? Because I know it is a relatively new term, but BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and all other people of color. And so now that we've defined it, I think a good question is, why has this term shifted from POC to BIPOC?
I think part of it has to do with the fact that Black people and Indigenous people have been around. And I think like this term is specific to America, but I think that they've been around for probably, as far as like racial minority groups, the longest. So like they've dealt with the most oppression from back like many centuries ago, and are still dealing with the reparations or still dealing with the consequences of that. So it's important to recognize that like even after 300-400 years that they still haven't achieved full equality, and so it's important to recognize that like they do have a history here, or like a longer history here, and like the foundation of our country was based off of taking advantage of the fruits of their labor.
Definitely, and Jane's bringing up an important point that we could consider, like the idea of why did they purposely put Black and Indigenous individuals at the forefront of the name, and maybe we could discuss that too.
I think it was in a way to like Jane was saying, to acknowledge, that that Black and Indigenous people have been battling this for centuries now. Like there was a it just came up in my head. There was a TV show, a sitcom, and I think in the '90s where these two Black kids, they were arrested for no reason because some white kids were vandalizing their car, right? And the white kids in jail was like, why can't you people just do what we do? He said my father came to this country, or my grandfather came to this country, and he worked hard and he made a living. He had nothing, but he made a living here. And the Black man was like, my country, my grandfather and his grandfathers built this country. They put the labor in, and didn't get any credit for it. Lot and like and for a real fact, for more like real facts, is just that lots of Black ideas have been stolen and by white. So like for an example, the cotton gin, I believe that was made by a Black man, stolen by a white slave owner, and he took the credit for it because Black people couldn't get a patent back then, and it was up for grabs, so he grabbed it. So I think that to put the Black and Indigenous on top of that, and was a way to acknowledge that we have been here fighting this for centuries, and Indigenous people have been fighting it even longer because they had their land stolen from them. They had smallpox blankets given to them, their women raped, and children killed because people wanted, because the white man wanted to try and take their land for their own. So that's what I believe it was there for.
Yeah, definitely. And another thought-provoking question is, do you guys think, is BIPOC the best term to use? Because I feel like it came out, everyone accepted it, but do you think it's the best term to use?
Why can't we just use terms for actual people? Why are we, I don't know who makes this up. I don't know what council, what entity is what think tank is doing this, but I just feel like there has to be a way where we can actually identify people as people and also identify them in their own experience. I feel like that breeds more of an effective conversation than just lumping them into a section and putting a label on them, which America has been, which its proclivity since the very beginning. They lump minorities up together, put a label on it, and then that's it. I think we can do so much better than just this abbreviated term.
I was actually just thinking the same thing. I feel like it's the easy way out. It's a lot easier for people just to say people of color have these issues and da-da. Well, what are the individual issues that each group is specifically facing? And then let's get more specific and look at gender identity, sexuality. Like, let's get more specific into these issues, because when you're doing, research on these things, you're going to find that each group is affected very, very differently. And not that one group might necessarily have more or less privileges, but the way their identities intersect is going to create a very different looking form of oppression.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think I saw a video recently that was saying, so you know how like we say that America is a melting pot, but the video was talking about how we should stop saying that, because melting pot assumes that we're just all mixed, we're just all one thing, but instead we should be like a fruit salad where we acknowledge everybody's differences and see, oh, there's that tomato, there's that thing, and there's that lettuce, and together it makes this nice fruit salad. So I think it's like synonymous with this.
So now we've had this great discussion, but just for time, we're going to switch it up a little bit. We're actually going to fasten our seatbelts because this is a very controversial conversation usually. So now that we've talked about these differences between different BIPOC groups and about the term BIPOC, let's talk about fetishization within those groups. So what do you guys define fetishization as? What do you think that is?
I think when we look at colorism, it's that exotic, it's sort of like when you're looking for a pet, right? Like you want an exotic, cute pet that you get to own and claim. And I think when you're looking at women specifically, women are already sexualized and treated like items. So when you add this exotic factor on top of it, I think it just makes it a lot worse. Yeah.
I think it's the objectification of somebody based, since we're talking about race and like in this context, and like based on their race.
So I see it in like two ways. There's that it's like a twisted expectation. So for one, one fetish is like a foot fetish, but not in this case. Would be like you like someone because you think you're spicy, so you want to like that spicy experience.
Definitely. So you guys are exactly defining it. I'll provide like just a definition so that we can keep moving and diving even deeper into these questions. But it just has to do with when you reduce human beings to their characteristics. And it's usually stereotypical of their race, ethnicity, or culture, and also often gender. But in this case, we're focusing on kind of race and culture and ethnicity. Then you're just objectifying them to kind of fulfill your own personal wishes and expectations of how they should look or behave. So that's kind of that definition that we're going to be working from as we keep going through these questions. And so what is the difference between having a preference versus fetishization?
I kind of see them as in the same realm of like, I think having a racial preference or having a fetish, having like a racial fetish is just in a more extreme version of having a preference. I think to say that you have a preference is kind of strange to me. I can see how people can have like a tendency for like a race, but to say that you have a preference, you're just closing off a lot of all different races just based off of what they look like. And like I understand that physical attraction is a component, but to say that you have a preference is like somewhat internalized racism.
I would agree and also disagree. I would say that I don't necessarily believe that the problem is regarding the preference. It's interesting how I'm thinking in my head, a lot of racial fetishes also deal with stereotypes as well. So how that also plays a part in it. I believe that it becomes an issue when a preference becomes an issue when there's a degradation of another. So I know for myself, I'm surrounded by a lot of African American men. Many Black men feel as if their preference is a Black woman, and for them, it's due to them feeling as if their future children are protected and safe because their future children, have an identity with their mother. Things of this nature. I don't think that's a problem. That's not necessarily me. That's not what I ascribe to. However, if that's their preference, I don't see how that would be an issue.
I was just going to say, I think it just comes down to the reasoning behind their preference, but also to add on that, you might say you have a preference, but I think it's really problematic when you are not all going to consider stepping outside of that box, right? Like, I think you can prefer, and that might be the people, you might swipe on Tinder, right? But if you come across someone, I think when it comes down to it, it's problematic when you're like, I'm not even going to talk to this person because they don't look how I want them to look.
Right, yeah. I was kind of thinking of preference as that, like just like completely closing off, but I can understand. And like Avery, you brought up a good point, but like I can understand if people have their own reasons for a preference, but if they're like still open-minded to people of other races, I don't really see a problem with that. But to close off other races because of, XYZ, then I think that that's why it kind of falls in the same realm of fetishization.
Yeah, definitely. And this week on a poll, when we asked whether it was wrong to have a racial preference in a partner, 54% said yes and 46% said no. So it's almost 50-50 split. And that's a conversation we've kind of started getting into. So is having a racial preference in a partner something that's problematic?
I don't think it's necessarily problematic. I think the issue is when you like we've all been saying, is when you start to when you start to demean them, you start to bring them down to either their characteristics, you start to bring them down to a level that makes them seem insignificant or less human, right? I think that like a lot of people, like I know a lot of people who they have preferences, but they have explored, like we've said, outside their preference, while some people have it, and the fetishization of people comes from where you start to say things like, I don't like women with short hair, I don't like bald women, or my girl has to have long hair, she has to be light skinned, or she has to look like this or like that, or even vice versa for males, that is when you start to demean someone and bring them down to a level of where they're an object and not necessarily a person, So I don't necessarily think that having a preference is necessarily bad. I think when you use that preference to put your characteristics of what you want in a box, and you put that person in that same box with them.
I can totally agree, and I grew up with a saying that the older African American generation used to say, and they say, "Watch those who sleep black but walk white." And it's this idea that you, for many, for some people, I won't say many, that there's a fetish regarding African American men. And a sexual fetish with that, and that can be for that. However, all I want to say regarding this is don't sleep black and don't fight for our issues. That's all I want to say. Don't intermingle with African Americans or black men in general if you're not willing to take up the mantle of also fighting for our freedom and our equality and equity in America. And that's for all, I think, for all racial preferences and things of that nature. You have to be able to take up the cross of that race as well.
I honestly have to agree with Avery 100% on that, because like, if you can't necessarily burden that same, your partner's burden too, like how you should in a relationship, especially if they are facing something so vile, like oppression and like racism and being, again, like put in a box, like you're not a person, you should not be with that person at all. I know there's not a couple therapy or anything like that, but like, you should not be with someone if you can't necessarily put yourself in that same boxing ring as they are in any problem. So
definitely. And like, to keep continuing this conversation, maybe like a specific example might help, because I know that I often hear and see on social media this idea of people talking about Black individuals preferring to solely date white individuals. And that's one of those specific things where they see it as very problematic. What do you guys think about that?
I'm sorry to keep answering questions. This is the topic that I really came for. But I would say I agree with my sister Courtney. It has to be the reasoning. I think Kodak Black a few years ago came out, and he was saying basically that he wanted a woman who was lighter than him. And as he began to talk, if you all know Kodak Black is black. And as he began to talk, you heard a lot of self-hate. And I feel like for some men who date white women or light women, the driving force, if we begin to talk to them and unveil and peel their heart, it's self-hate. It's you not being able to handle your own skin and whatever that comes with. But again, if people have a preference, I don't mind that. I just, again, we attack the reasoning behind it. Where is there any self-hate involved? Is there a degradation? Is there like a stigma that you are attributing your mind to continually? So that's where I stand.
Usually people have a problem with the idea of Black individuals preferring to solely date white individuals. But playing devil's advocate, usually people praise the idea of Black love when Black individuals solely want to date Black individuals. So what do you guys think about that? Like, are they problematic? Are they not? Like, we've kind of been talking about, like Avery kind of brought up, it's about the reasoning. What do you guys think of that and that kind of difference?
Yeah, going back to it being about the reasoning. Personally, for me, every time I've heard a Black person say they want to date within the Black community, their reasoning is because they think, Black people just don't get enough love in this culture, right? We need to love our own people, support our own people, love our children, right? We don't want to make mixed, not that there's anything wrong with having mixed babies, I'm mixed, right? But having mixed light-skinned babies because, that's fetishized, right? Like, we want these exotic looking children. But personally, I've never heard a Black person that wants to date another Black person reason it in a way that is really problematic. It's always in a way of uplifting the Black community in America.
Just going a little further, Courtney, I know you mentioned exotic. Like, what is this idea of exotic? Because I feel like there's technically not a definition for it, but people use that term a lot. And you don't have to answer it.
I'm laughing because me and my friends have talked about this a lot, and me, my mom, and my sisters, but I feel like it's being white enough, right? Having the European facial type, right? But then having that just little something, right? So having the white facial features, but then maybe having the bigger Black lips, right? Having the Black curvy body and then having the kinky curly hair. And it's funny because I was actually watching something and they were saying, you know, Black features on Black women aren't attractive, but Black features on white women are, you know, like they're getting all these surgeries to get the bigger lips, you know, doing the hair different, getting the implants to have the stereotypical curvy Black woman figure.
I was thinking, like, we've been talking about fetishization within like the dating realm, and I was thinking, does fetishization exist outside of the dating realm? For example, I'm thinking of instances where like white people might look at a Black athlete and just think that, oh, just because they're Black, they're going to be more athletic, for example, or they're going to dominate more in a certain sport. So I was kind of curious, what do you guys think about that? Like fetishization outside of the dating?
I think it exists like a lot, especially in the sports context. You know, when I was in high school, I did lots of sports. You know, it was like when I was thinking about colleges, my football coach was telling me, you know, you need to apply. And I'm like, or you need to be scouted, you know. And I was wondering, you know, why do I need to be scouted? You know, I want to go to college for academics, not necessarily for sports. Sports would be nice, but it'll be too much, you know. And there will be other kids who are just as good as me, who are white, and they didn't want to be scouted. He wasn't going to them and hassling them about it. But I was constantly being hassled, saying, you know, you should be scouted. You need to be scouted. You know, you're good. You have potential. This, that, and the third. And I really do agree that, you know, that is true. And another place where it could be race could be, someone could be fetishized is where how, like, and this is more of a racial stereotype, how like an Asian person is better at math. You know, if you want to win a math, any type of math contest, get an Asian person on your team. You know, or if you want to do well in like grammar or something like that, ask a woman. You know, things like that. You know.
Have you guys seen the movie Get Out? Yeah, I just think that that's like a prime example of the current topic that we're talking about. Yeah, so like Jordan Peele did a great job of highlighting something that I've never seen in any other movie in Hollywood.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I guess my one of my like thought bubbles is going off, and is it really a problem to want to marry within your race to preserve and within your race and ethnicity to preserve your culture and tradition? Because I do know that there are those that do that, you know, that, you know, in order to preserve the culture and ethnicity in their own race, they continue that on. And I know for many African Americans, I know for many of them, it's a safety mechanism against oppression. Like, let's band together in love in order to fight what's going on out there. So I don't know. I just want to throw that out there. I don't know.
Right. Me personally, I don't think there's something wrong with it at all. You know, I think it's a great thing. But I also believe that culture isn't necessarily deemed for one specific type of people. You know, I think that if it's not appropriate, if it's not taken and stolen and used in a way and like that's like a commodity, how like for Halloween, some white people might dress up like a I don't know, like a mariachi person for symbolize like a Mexican person. You know, I think if it's understood and passed on and learned, you know, you can be of any type of race and learn someone's culture as long as you're not appropriating from that culture. So I do think that it is fine, it is okay, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with being with someone of the same race to preserve a culture. But I do think that the beauty of our like the human species is just that, you know, we can come together and we can make something. Sometimes combining different things can make it better. It can make a different culture, or you can just share your culture with someone else. You know.
And to add on to that, I think it can become problematic when colorism comes into play, because I think a lot of the times, you know, we forget, but like within, at least in the Black community, like there is a lot of colorism within our group. And I think sometimes with that, it can go to being, you know, you're less Black, you know, you're not as Black. I know when I was younger, when I was, fresh from England, I still had a taint of, my accent. Like I was seen as less Black. And no one even knew I was a quarter, but just not being a Black American, I was seen as less Black. But then my younger sisters being very light skinned, but growing up with a darker sister and a darker dad and a darker mom, she's been having this internal struggle because she wants to talk about Black issues, because while she has not experienced them firsthand necessarily, she's experienced them through us. What people say about us that affects her directly, even though they might not be targeting her in the moment. So I think sometimes it can just become problematic within our own community when we're sort of saying you're not Black enough.
Yeah, I think that, so I don't know if it's a problem or not. Like some people believe that you're not just marrying the person, you're marrying the family as well, and vice versa. So that's when like things can happen. And then with like when you're raising your kids and all that. Now if that's a problem or not, I don't know. I don't know if that's I'm still like, I think about that all the time, if it's a problem or not. I still haven't found that answer yet.
Well, I have a lot of racist family members. Let's just put it.
And I think it's interesting, this idea of colorism that Courtney just brought up. Can we dive deeper into that? So what is colorism? Just in case anyone doesn't know, what would you define that as?
Would it be something where like you put someone of the same color or the same race down because they don't necessarily do something that is a stigma for that race? So like for an example, like I joke around with my best friend like this, but she doesn't like fried chicken, and so I might say, "Oh, you're not Black." So would that be kind of like colorism?
That's more like just like a stereotype. Colorism, I'll just give the definition. Colorism is like prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same ethnic or racial group. So like sometimes, like for example, like oftentimes in Latinx households, the older generation might pressure younger ones to date only white people and Black people to like mejorar la raza, like to make the race better, or better the race, because then it lightens the race. That's like colorism. And that was just an example to kind of like give you a physical example of that. So like, what are some ways in which colorism manifests itself other than that?
I mean, I definitely think the point that you brought up of in the Latinx community specifically, the idea of either bettering the race or keeping the race is like, or keeping the race clean, which is a horrible way to say it, but people say it like that, is a really big way that like colorism manifests itself. I think, like you said, the younger generation is encouraged to, date people that are going to keep the race lighter. And it's a really big issue within our community. And sometimes it's not as overt as like, you can't date a Black person because it's like, oh, your kids are going to be so cute with, light skin and blue eyes, and oh, don't go, dating them, like your kids won't look a certain way. Or it's sometimes like within the community, people make different comments that aren't overtly saying, don't date a certain, group of people, but it kind of leans towards that idea that lighter is better.
I think Bella brought it up earlier that, for example, in Spanish, in Latinx or Hispanic TV, for example, in telenovelas, we often see that most of the actors and actresses are of lighter skin tones, mostly white, and I think it's definitely a problem because it's not really representative of the the Latinx community. It doesn't represent the Afro-Latinx community at all, I feel.
Yeah, and building off of that, Nick Jonas's wife, Priyanka Chopra, she's Indian American or Indian, forget which, but she was getting a lot of comments towards her because she was protesting against racism, but she would promote skin lightening creams on billboards and stuff like that, and so.
Yeah, definitely. And like, we're just switching topics just because of time, and this next one's definitely going to be like one of those bigger conversations. But like on the poll this week, we asked individuals, can you be both privileged and oppressed at the same time? So we've discussed privilege, we've discussed oppression, but can you be both at the same time? 100% of people said yes, actually. And I just want to know what you guys think about that.
I think this goes back, at least for me, like to what I was saying earlier about it really just depends on the space, right? Because if you're a Black male, you have privileges in being a male, but obviously, you know, depending on the space, one identity might be more salient than the other. So I think, you know, depending on the context you're in, one is sort of gonna up and one isn't.
Yeah, definitely. And like kind of going off of that, Courtney, and what you said earlier, can you raise your hand if you've ever heard of the statement, this is an oppression Olympics? Has anyone ever heard of that, this idea of oppression Olympics? Does anyone want to speak to that? Or like kind of what that is?
So I guess in the context that I've seen it, when somebody is talking about oppression of their own demographic, or, you know, like being a woman or being a Black person, somebody else will come in and try, or maybe it's not in their intention to try to diminish the other person's argument, but it's to say, oh, well, like I deal with this too, like, but I bet you don't, you know, type of thing, to try to invalidate the other person's oppression by bringing up an instance of another form of oppression.
Yeah, exactly what you said. It's just when two or more groups are kind of competing to prove which group is more oppressed than the other. And like, why do you think that they use this term oppression Olympics? What's it trying to highlight about this idea of groups trying to like compete for what group is more oppressed? Or like, why is that problematic?
I think it deflects from the actual issue at hand. When people are spending time trying to decide who's more oppressed, it takes time away from trying to solve the problem that oppression exists in general. And so instead of trying to argue with one another about who is more oppressed, you should be working together to dismantle the issue.
And I think it's problematic also because in a lot of progressive circles, oppression can become trendy. And it's almost like, you know, I'm oppressed, woo woo, but it misses the actual depth and pain of the oppression. That this oppression is actually killing people. And so why would you want to do some type of victim tournament or oppression Olympic when you realize how the depth and the severity of the issue of oppression?
I think it's also bad because you're at that point, you're not even trying to come together. You're trying to say, oh, well, boohoo for me more because I have it worse than you, you know, and not necessarily band together to stop the oppression, but you're trying to use the oppression itself as a way to say, not necessarily say I'm better than you, but to say I'm winning at this, if you get what I'm saying.
A specific example that I just thought of was that I saw this Facebook post. It was two pictures side by side. The one picture was of George Floyd, and then with some details about his death. And then on the other side was a picture of a white man, details of his death. Both were killed by police officers by being suffocated to death. And so like basically the point of the post was, why doesn't this white man get any attention? And so I think that's an example of like kind of what we're talking about. Because, you know, like, so you agree that police brutality is an issue. So why are you spending time trying to argue, you know, like this happens to us too. So I think it takes time and energy away from the real issue at hand.
And I think that this was something that we kind of talked about earlier, the idea of individuals kind of focusing on that one oppressed group that they're in rather than like the privileged group. So why do you guys think it's so hard for us to recognize our own privileges?
I think it's hard for people who are, because I think it's hard for us to recognize our own privileges because most of the time we have been put down so much in a way that is blatant and obvious that we know about, that we just focus our attention on that. We kind of become tunnel vision to the oppression that we have dealt with, and not necessarily see the privileges that we have, or the other, maybe the other oppression that we have that's not necessarily deemed because of our skin color, you know, because for again, a black male will probably make more money than a white woman in the same field because he's a male, right? So we don't necessarily look at the other privileges or oppression that we might face because Right now, we're all tunnel vision to the racial oppression and the racial stigmatization that we face.
I think for our white brothers and sisters, one of the things that like I always hear as a retort and a rebuttal against the idea of privilege is they always say, in quotations, you know, are you trying to say I didn't work to get what I got? You know, and it's this idea that they are missing the actual point of the argument of privilege. We're saying, you know, we're not saying you did not work at all, but we're also saying you worked in a system that was designed for you. And I feel like once we take certain, you know, societal stigmas off the idea of privilege, that's when we will educate people and get more allies. You know, like even as I said, just a minuscule point. But as a right-handed person, I have privilege. You know, that's something that, you know, I'm not saying that, no one's saying that I didn't do good. I did good on the test only because I'm right-handed, you know. However, that's as long as we begin to educate people and make this actually a topic of discussion all the time, I do think that it will breed change and understanding.
For me, I think it also goes down to discrimination versus oppression, right? Like talking about discrimination on an individual level and then oppression looking at the systemic level. Sort of like what I was saying earlier, and this is a rough example, but for example, you know, a darker skinned person, right, might have grown up in a neighborhood with a lot of Black folks, right? So let's say they didn't face a lot of discrimination from white people because they didn't see any white people, right? This isn't a perfect example, but then you could have someone who's lighter skinned, almost white passing, right? But if they went to a super racist, all white school down south, they will have faced a lot more discrimination just because of their situation. So I feel like for that lighter skinned individual in this scenario, they might say, well, how are you more oppressed than me? Because this is what I faced. But I think it's coming to the understanding that there's a difference between the systemic oppression and the individualized instances of like discrimination.
Definitely. Such an important point. As an ending question, so just consider, and this is like, it's a big question. So like, considering the intersectionality within our identities, does focusing on the disadvantages faced by one particular group erase the experiences of other marginalized groups? And how can we acknowledge the presence of both privilege and oppression within our different identities?
For the first part, for me, I think yes, you can erase. I think a good example is with the Black Lives Matter movement and focusing on police brutality. We focus on men a lot. A lot of women weren't talked about. So I think in focusing on it, it's great, but I think we forgot to talk about women, right? We forgot to talk about trans folk and et cetera, other people within the Black community. So I think sometimes we do sort of overshadow them when we're focused on one group.
I'm just going to run at it. I'm going to say yes and no to the beginning part of the question. I do not feel like it's a problem to focus on one individual group of people's marginalization. And I feel like sometimes I feel like, yes, it is a problem if it's in terms of like what Courtney brought up, you know, when that other group of people are also in the injustice. That's a time where, yes, we need to talk about the other groups of people. However, when it's a particular group of people focusing on this particular injustice, and we're talking about, you know, an oil spill somewhere else that's affecting another group of people, I think that can have its day. You know, I feel like sometimes in our culture we conflate too many issues, and that's why we don't get a lot done. For part two, acknowledging your privilege and helping other disadvantaged people, I just feel like as a man, you have a privilege to help and advance women. Do it. You know, I think speak up, say something, let them have the floor. Of course, don't take the mic because, you know, we can do that as well. But speak up, you know, allow your voice to aid the advancement of the group of people. And that just doesn't involve just men. That could be white people, our white brothers and sisters. We need you all as allies. You know, I think one of the greatest impacts of the BLM movement was that we had white brothers and sisters throwing stuff. I love that. You know, we need that out there in order to promote change. And so that's what I'll say.
Definitely. And actually, someone asked a question that kind of relates exactly to what you were talking about, Avery. So we could also loop back to this question, but I wanted to ask it just because it goes directly. They said, do you feel that Black people are more motivated to push for equality for others But when it comes to Black rights, people of other races aren't as likely to do so for Black people.
I think that's spot on. I think that yes, like Black people do we do try and push for a lot of equality for other people in other races, and we don't get that same treatment back because as you hear like from a lot of people from from the Latinx community or from the people who are from Asian descent, you know, being dark to in some of these cultures is looked at as a bad thing. You know, being of a darker skin color is like it's like COVID sometimes. You know, and that is hearing that and knowing that tells it tells a story right there. You know, we are not looked at as the same as some Black people look at other cultures and other people of other cultures who are facing the same oppression as us. You know.
And looking at like the feminist movement, like specifically, you know, Black women were left out of that. And that's actually the whole reason that intersectionality had to be coined, was to account for Black women's experiences. Because in that movement, yeah, women were focused on, but Black women, right, and other women of color were just completely left out of the picture.
I think many of the Black people Black Americans have a very interesting relationship with America due to how we got here and how we became and overcame all these traumas, to the degree that many of the other POCs that come to America benefit from the blood that was spilled by African Americans. And I think that that kind of idea plays out when we talk about things like this, how Black people are engaged in other protests and things of that nature that don't involve them. I think a part of that is because a part of our culture is overcoming the oppression of America. That's embedded in our culture. I mean, we have holidays. Juneteenth is because of the overcoming, and not that we overcame on Juneteenth. Come on, but the overcoming of the oppression. And I feel like that is the relationship. And I don't necessarily feel like that's always reciprocated, but that's because a lot of other cultures and races have to deal with their own anti-Blackness and / anti-Black Americanness.
I think another part of it has to do with it's not my problem. It's not directed towards me. It's not, you know, I don't live in this issue, so I am not going to speak out on it. While Avery hit it again on the nail as usual, we have had to fight oppression in and of itself throughout America's history, and before America was even, you know, indoctrinated. You know, we have had to fight oppression itself constantly. You know, so I think that is, I agree with Avery. I think that is why we are so quick to hop on the bandwagon and help other people who face different oppression, different problems, but yet we are not getting that same aid because it's not their problem. They don't face that. They don't have that issue. Or again, you know, again, it's just it's not their problem.
And I just want to add, I'm sorry, I just want to add, this is not putting Black Americans on a pedestal of any sort, because there are some Black Americans that don't fight for Black American stuff. You know what I'm saying? Hint, 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 Candace Owens, pray for her. But like, with all that to be said, this is a matter of education. Like, we need to educate people on history and on what we see the future of America to be. And if we do that, I do feel like other cultures, ethnicities, races will get involved in the struggle for greater unity.
I kind of just want to ask a question. So you can view it from a different perspective. So like the fight for equality for Black people, it takes so much energy, and it's an ongoing fight that's been happening for centuries in America now. So it takes so much energy to just fight for yourselves. What do you think, like how much energy do you have left to fight for other people?
And to add on to that, when you have like the other identities, I feel like that's what really makes it tiring. Because I feel like sometimes you need to pick and choose. Like, yes, Black people, right? But I feel like sometimes when we say Black people, we are unconsciously referring to Black men, right? A lot of the issues are directed to men. So then it's like, wow, now I need to do an abundance more of research just to figure out what it's like to be a woman. And then, you know, adding all the other, you know, identities that other people might have. I feel like sometimes you don't have enough energy to fight for yourself.
I think in a way, the way I kind of look at it isn't necessarily fighting for, the individual characteristics of people, like fighting for women, fighting for Black people or people on LGBTQ community.
Yeah, like the environment even, or immigrants.
Yeah, I think of fighting not for, but fighting the problem. You know, because when you try and fight for something, yes, you have to divide things up into different categories and different segmentations. But when you fight the overarching issue, band everyone together, because again, we are all one people. We just have different types of melanin in our skin, different types of cultures, but we are all still one people. If you fight the given problem, then there's enough energy to go around for everyone. But again, we don't live in a society that thinks like that. So
The way I see it is like when you see another person in pain, right? When you're able to empathize, when you're able to have empathy for what's going on to other people, and if you respond with indifference or even outright hostility, it seems utterly like incomprehensible. So it's like that. I think that's where like energy can come from. Seeing that you can empathize with somebody, and then knowing that this is my problem too. I got it.
I'm thinking about this. There's a saying, the strong bear the infirmities of the weak. And I realized as you asked the question, Jane, I thought to myself, it's almost like my brother's injustice has to become my own if we're going to ever succeed in America. Like until, especially BI, POC communities actually look at the lens of America and says, the injustice of the indigenous people is my injustice, and I'll fight for that. And I feel like that would lighten the load for not only Black people, but for any minority group, that we could all come together and strive and push for that. That's just where my head goes, because I don't think we'll ever have a just society unless we deal with the injustices of our brothers and sisters. There's just no way.
Yeah, you put it really well.
So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I want to give a special thank you to each of our panelists for sharing their own personal experiences and thoughts and knowledge to each of these questions, and for making this discussion super deep, super insightful, and super amazing. So thank you guys. This video is going to be accessible via Tumbao's YouTube channel, tumbao.lu, and their Instagram. So tune in next Friday for the next topic, which will be focused on the media, which we actually started talking about a little bit today. So it's going to go deeper into that. So thank you guys all for joining.